Hello, Musical Talk listeners. My name is Mike Shapiro. One genre of musical that's uncommon today, and perhaps less common than it ought to be, is the period drama. These shows often have large casts, lavish sets, and scores that, if not precisely drawn from the music of the period, don't feel deliberately contemporary. Shows like Titanic, Les Mis, or Evita. We might speculate as to why these musicals have been displaced by shows set in present day, or high-concept reimaginations of the past with anachronistic language and music. Perhaps it's because giant barricades are expensive, or because who really wants to research how people spoke in 1850 anyway? Regardless, new entrants into the period drama musical genre do exist, bringing all the scope and ambition of their forebears. One example is the subject of today's episode, Soviet Zion, written by Giles Howe with Katie Lipson and Robert Trapini. Join me as I chat with Giles about this intriguing musical set during a unique social experiment before and during World War II. Giles, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's my pleasure.
I thought we'd start off by asking you a bit about yourself and your background as a musical theater creator.
Sure, you got it. So my name is Giles. Originally, I'm from the UK, and my background as a musical theater creative began, I guess, when I was about 15, 16, and I started writing what would have been the world's worst musical ever. But through pursuing that and kind of opening doors and knocking on different doors, I just kind of became involved in a community of creative people that would strongly encourage each other creatively. And I started writing another musical, which was hopefully a lot better.
I think everybody's first musical is a candidate for worst musical ever. And the choice that we have is how early to have that experience and to move past it. So I think you were shrewd in doing that in your teen years.
Indeed. Well, hopefully I got it out of the way. So I wrote another piece with a good friend of mine, Miss Katie Lipson. And we staged it several times around London. And we decided that our experience of producing this work gave us skills that we were able to share with other people who perhaps didn't have those skills or resources, who were themselves very creative in writing musicals, but not necessarily able to bring them off the page. And so we made the most of living in a very dynamic and vibrant city, which is full of creative people who wanted to avail themselves of new writing. And so we started a theatre company dedicated to new musical theatre called the A Stage Kindly New Musical Theatre Initiative. We actually produced 14 different productions in a space of about 3 years or so, of new writing, and we were one of the, if not the only, theatre company at that time that was offering the opportunity for exposure for international writers that we were doing, and we were receiving fantastic works. We put on some really terrific shows, but few of the pieces that we were receiving to our literary department were in this particular style of those musicals that drew Katie and I first into the theatre. We existed on a diet of Les Mis and Chess and Phantom and all these big mega musicals from the 80s, and that was what we lived and breathed, and that was our alphabet. That's how we would communicate with each other, and we loved that style so much, and we realized, we have all the skills between us that we can actually create something to honor that genre, with the skills that we do have. And it seemed like the most ambitious thing we could possibly do. And, well, why should that stop us?
So this is an excellent segue to the show we're discussing today, which is indeed a historically based, dramatically weighty, quasi-operatic show, isn't it?
That's a very good way to describe it. It sits in a it sits slightly between the genres of contemporary opera and musical theatre. I wanted to involve elements of both of those that excite me the most. I personally love operatic singing. I think there are certain times that it allows the human spirit to shine in a way that nothing else does, and the strength of it and the emotional intensity and the response that it elicits in a listener, I just think are terrific. And so I knew I wanted to involve good sopranos. I mean, I wanted to, and a good amount of them as a feature of the show's sound. But I also wanted to involve a very driven musical. I wanted to create a very driven musical paradigm that took that voice type in a direction that I thought was quite new and innovative. And so you can hear very clearly some of the influences on my writing and on our writing from shows like Chess, which is my absolute favorite score, and Christina, which is another musical that the same composers created, or I should say that's rather a folk opera. And you can hear that I listen a lot to Turandot and to Nixon in China, and I think those come across just as clearly as the mega musicals that inspired this work.
It's interesting that you mentioned Nixon in China as a role model, because I remember in listening to the concept album thinking a few times, I almost feel like there's a little bit of a John Adams flavor here. Now, let's talk a little bit about the subject matter of this show, which I thought was really interesting. I thought when I was listening to the concept album that this is a little bit like Fiddler in the Roof in reverse, where there's a Jewish immigration into Russia and they're actively being invited. So can you give a little bit of a historical context for the show and the setting?
Yes, absolutely. So during the time the show is set, which is it starts in the early 1930s, there was a lot of political upheaval and turmoil in Europe and the world, and especially in regards to what was considered at the time the Jewish problem, which was that a populace existed without, or in a diaspora, essentially, without a territory of its own. And this created political and social issues that lots of different people would weigh in on how to address the problems that it was creating, the social problems that existed at that time, particularly for the Jewish people. So one of the answers to this problem is I don't like that wording, but one of the solutions that was offered to some of the problems facing the Jewish people at that time was Zionism, which is the idea of a return of the diaspora to its ancestral homeland in Israel. But this show is obviously set 20 years before Israeli independence, and so I actually went to Israel, which is one of the things that inspired this show, on an organized trip called Taglit, and they talked a little bit about some of the other alternatives to settling Israel. There was a Madagascar project or a Uganda project, and there were all these different places that were discussed as a territory, and one of them was in the far east of Russia, not too far from Siberia. And what was most interesting about this particular endeavor was that it in fact did happen. It wasn't just a hypothesis or a theoretical proposal. It was something that actually happened. So around that time, there was a national policy that entitled each of the ethnic minorities within the Soviet Union their own territory over which to exercise a certain degree of autonomy. And because the Jewish people were included as one of the ethnicities of Russia, they were entitled to a land under this policy, which essentially granted the Jewish people the first Jewish state of the modern era. And this idea was very appealing to people who came from all over the world. Most of them came from within the Soviet Union, but people came from Palestine, from Argentina, from the United States, and from all over the place to take part in this nation-building exercise, which for many years was spoken about in the same breath as the idea of settling Israel as an alternative to it. And it really fascinated me, a couple of things, that some of the differences between what it set out to be from what Israel set out to be. For example, Israel is Hebrew speaking, and there is a strong religious narrative that connects the people to the land and the history, whereas this territory in Siberia has no historical connection to these people. And it was created as a Yiddish-speaking territory where religion was to be phased out, essentially, and it was a social experiment to remove the religious aspect from Jewish identity and to recreate what it meant to be a Jew by working the land and through agriculturalism and socialism. They would build this utopia. It just stuck in my head in this weirdly obsessive way. And then when that happens, usually my imagination and my creativity kick in. And I thought, well, how can I explore these questions about how this alternative, parallel national narrative can relate to me and my own identity? And I had questions returning from this trip to Israel about how to reconcile my own Eastern European cultural heritage with the idea of belonging in the Middle East. This story offered me as a creative a framework in which to explore questions that I had about my own self and identity and my own place in the world and my own sense of belonging. And it gave me an opportunity to bring together these very different archetypes, these old world, Stetly, Hamishy, Fiddler on the Roof types, with this Jewish American princess with a bright red lip and a fur stole, and to see how they would each respond to the challenges that this curious setting demands of them.
So as the show begins, we're in this village, this historical anomaly where in Stalinist Russia, there's this remote village of Birobidzhan, and the Soviets have invited Jews worldwide to come and settle, and offered them essentially amnesty and a certain degree of autonomy and property rights at a time when all of this is being denied to Jews worldwide. And you are you're focusing primarily on the exploits of two families of settlers from very different backgrounds, but having a common cultural context.
That's absolutely correct. Yes, one family come from the Ukraine and the other family come from Malibu.
So that really couldn't be more different culturally, except they have a religious belief and a cultural heritage in common.
Precisely.
And that, plus the shifting political sands of the environment in which they've found themselves, which, as we'll learn, turns out to be a little bit of a devil's bargain and not quite the utopia that's promised, makes for great musical drama.
Thank you.
So give us now that we've looked at the historical setting of the show, give me a rundown of the story that you are telling.
The story essentially looks at the lives of these two families and how their lives intertwine. So it's not necessarily a clear, this is happening, this is the story of this happening to this person. Rather, it's quite a complex, and these lives weave together in fairly complex ways. But essentially, the Ukrainian family come over. They're full of zeal, and they're very excited to build this new land. But when they arrive, it's not exactly as they had been led to expect it might be. They had been rather misled by the propaganda that brought them there. But they don't really have any options. So best foot forwards, and they ultimately knew they were going there to be peasants, that it was going to be a tough existence, and that's exactly what they're faced with. So keep calm and carry on. And in the meantime, the American family arrive. We later find out that it wasn't just ideological fervor that brought them to the other side of the world. Rather, it was a scandal that chased them away from home. Now, the father from the Ukrainian family gets thrown in jail for something quite insignificant and essentially a completely innocent act that was twisted into being a criminal act, and his wife must campaign for his release. In the meantime, she and the father of the American family begin to have feelings for each other, which makes her feel very conflicted. And indeed, much of the focus of the show is on this woman's conflict within herself, the conflict between these two men who she has feelings for, the conflict between right and wrong, and this woman ultimately often gets what she wants, but it's never really what she wants. I'm trying to condense 2.5 hours into a minute.
Right. That's the trick, isn't it? Especially when there's so much politically going on as the backdrop of the show, and then we have the interpersonal drama in the foreground that we're really focusing on musically.
It's insincere that I should praise your poor decision. It was you who led us to this place and made it so we've no escape. Why on earth do we deserve this? A string of beastly acts of pointless cruelty to the point of no return. You're testing me beyond my breaking point, unraveling all my loyalty. Why must he destroy the very love we share? Why must he torture me from within myself, turning our whole world upside down? Though trust is gone, life must go on. I'll campaign Isa's release until I drop, distracting myself from the heart of betrayal. He gave us hope, but now he snatches it away, and I have nothing more to say. To me, he's dead as of today.
And the show really is about the interpersonal drama set against the backdrop of the wider political goings on. The show is definitely not a history lesson, and it very much focuses on these people's emotional responses to what's happening around them. But ultimately, the Ukrainian woman does get her husband released from prison, but he returns a changed man. And so again, although she gets what she wants, it's not exactly what she really wanted, and then has to move forward according to this whole new set of challenges, that she must relate to this man, that this man who's essentially a stranger to her. In the meantime, each one of the characters has their own arc of how they're making peace with where they are, or trying to escape, and each of those decisions that they're trying to make have their own challenges, and it's all woven together across a time frame from the late 1930s, the mid 1930s through to the mid 1940s, and in the meantime, the country goes to war. The boys are sent to the front, and all sorts of things change and happen to the political context in which these people are living, so that their own sense of themselves and their own sense of belonging is constantly in turmoil and flux, according to these big winds of history and change that are blowing all around them.
There's an interesting analogy to be drawn to the story of the Titanic, in a way, because you have a big endeavor which is launched with great fanfare and optimism, and we, the audience, recognize that the optimism is premature and misplaced, because we understand that we can see into the future because we know historically what happened, and we know that things are not going to be as good as they were advertised at the beginning. And likewise with Borobudur, we know what is initially portrayed to be a warm socialist Jewish utopia is not going to bear out to be as welcoming or hospitable as it's portrayed. So we see these naively hopeful people arriving, and we know what's ahead. So that, to me, seems to be a really interesting source of dramatic tension, the contrast between the bright-eyed hopefulness of the settlers and our knowledge that the Soviet Union in the 30s was not a hospitable place for anyone.
Indeed, that's relying on the audience's knowledge of current affairs and to an extent the outcome of different parts of the Second World War. We do rely on that as a device to create, like you said, to create dramatic tension without giving away the end too much. That we especially rely on that at the end, as these characters are full of hope and perhaps a naivety that we know is misplaced, because we see, obviously we live in the future, that these characters are looking to the future, but we're actually living in it. It was important when we were writing this to consider to what extent are people familiar with some of what we're discussing, because for example, do we need to spoon feed what are these Jewish traditions that people are doing on Passover, or do we need to just rely that the audience know what's going on? Do we need to explain the pact between the pact between Russia and Germany, or do we understand that the audience kind of know what that means?
I like how there was some gentle, playful teasing of Jewish culture in the ceremony of the Seder. I particularly loved the lyric, "To make a long story short would be disrespectful," in terms of the self-celebration. So you strike a good balance in sharing that aspect of Jewish culture, not assuming everybody in the audience understands, but doing it in a natural way that doesn't feel like a contrived documentary.
Precisely. I feel that I'm presuming that most of the audience who will see this show, if they're not Jewish, they will have seen Fiddler on the Roof. And so they've seen the song Tradition, and they kind of get that's enough to get where we're going, that we don't need to spoon feed little minute details, but we can actually focus on the drama, the interpersonal drama, rather than explaining necessarily the historical or cultural context of what's going on. We jump straight into the emotional responses to these people's circumstances.
In a very similar spirit, the daughter of the Ukrainian family gets a job as essentially newsreader. She broadcasts the news as it is given to her, and she becomes a local celebrity in the settlement. And through her relaying current events, we, the audience, learn what's going on in the larger world and have a sense of how that's going to impact the fate of these characters.
Precisely. It also offers a timeline so that through her radio announcements, we know perhaps what's currently going on and what is currently most relevant in terms of current affairs that are affecting these people.
One of the most chilling moments for me along these lines is when Zofia is making an announcement that the Soviet Union is no longer fighting Nazi Germany, but now has signed a non-aggression pact, essentially is allying themselves with Hitler. And that's obviously an event that's going to have a huge impact on the fate of the colony. So just as you said, hearing about that has both informational value, but also dramatic value. At least that's how I experienced it.
Absolutely, and that in that scene in particular, it's being touted as great news, and the rest of Russia, of course, is going to celebrate. Oh, how wonderful! We're no longer enemies. We have an alliance, and we're working together, and this is something to celebrate. But the people of Birobidzhan, the Jewish community in particular, know that this isn't good news. This is for them absolutely terrible news, and so it's very much it puts them in a very difficult position, because they want to be loyal and they want to celebrate the good news of the leadership, but at the same time they know that there are terrible consequences that put them into a very difficult political situation.
And the Soviets were particular that people be enthusiastic about the state of the Soviet Union. They put a high premium on people being emotionally ardent supporters of the Soviet Union. They didn't want to see mixed emotions.
Absolutely. One of my favorite scenes in the show is when that pact is announced, and they look for a volunteer to toast the decision on air, to celebrate the decision live on air. And Morel, the mother from the Ukrainian family, is cornered into making an on-air toast to celebrate the decision, but the humiliation that she feels for having to very publicly celebrate something that she knows to be, or that she considers to be, an enormous betrayal, kind of tips her over an emotional cliff, really puts her over the edge. And she resolves in that moment to cease her loyalty to Stalin and his leadership, and instead campaign tirelessly for the release of her husband. And it's one of many moments of betrayal that really shape her character.
I see the story as having, or your show rather, as having both an inner conflict and an outer conflict. And the outer conflict is exactly what you were describing, the issue of to what extent do you balance the need of self-preservation when you're under the thumb of a power that holds all the cards and demands your loyalty? And how do you balance the need to placate those powers with maintaining your own integrity, which is a really interesting dramatic subject, and of course is fertile grounds for dramatic music.
More important than a dream is to work hard. The most important thing in life is to survive. This does not come easy, not least of all for you know who's. Be grateful though, as we are still alive. This place is an alternative to Zion. This place so far away from Palestine. If we work our socks off, there'll be food upon our plates tonight. Complacency will lead to discontentment.
It won't taste quite as good as their pastrami.
Maybe next year if we try again, Iser, don't make fun.
For several failed harvests we've been patient with our crops. Our friends have all returned back to whence they came. Honestly, I can't say that I blame them.
If they had our strength, they'd still be here. Honestly, I pity those who left. It was a last resort.
Years of hardship whittled their resolve.
That will not befall me, this I tell you. I'm sticking to my guns no matter what. In a year, perhaps a few, Barabijan will flourish too. In a year, perhaps a year or two.
There's lots of challenges to people's integrity throughout this. Without, I don't want to be too specific because I don't want to give anything too much away for people who haven't yet heard it. But there are lots of challenges of people's integrity, of how to respond to difficult situations that mean you have to compromise your own wishes, or indeed in order to maintain the safety of yourself and those you love.
And this is, of course, a universal theme and situation that can be found not just in this particular historical context, but is meaningful today.
Absolutely. There's lots of, I think there are lots of parallels in this story that make it very relevant today. Obviously, the themes of rising to challenges is universal, and the themes of crises of faith and challenges to one's integrity are universal. But there are some very specific ideas and themes that the show explores about nationhood and a sense of belonging, and what really defines your sense of belonging, and that theme of to where do I belong and what defines that is something that runs throughout the entire show.
Now, this is, of course, a musical, so I thought we'd take a look, or I thought we would talk a bit about the musical treatment and inspiration for this show. What was your initial inspiration for coming upon a musical language for this particular story?
So Katie and I, who wrote the show together, have indeed a shared love for the mega musical, for those big 1980s shows. That it's just such a personal love for that music that's the first thing that we wanted to honor. And although it might make sense to do a show like this with very small forces, a small klezmer band or just a piano, as we had done it in the past, this show from the very inception was defined, at least in my head, by this very thick, rich, dense and lavish symphonic orchestral sound. That sound is so integral to this piece for me. And it was really thrilling recording it at the end of last year, hearing that all come together, because having only been able to demonstrate that sound that I had envisioned through a piano and a voice, to finally have this enormous orchestral sound out of my head and into the world was just wonderful. But the reasons that we needed this lavish texture were because we have such powerful operatic voices in the cast. We needed a texture that supports that and allows for that to be, that normalizes it. Because if these are simple people living simple lives, why are they singing in this completely over the top, hyper exaggerated way? Well, the reason for that is because even though they're very simple and small players, they're part of a big continuum of history, and the wider game in which they are essentially pawns is played on a huge scale. And so the music needed to reflect the historical scope of what's going on, the wider picture, not just the humdrum of their basic lives, but this enormous sweep of history that they're part of.
Do you want me with all these bruises? Can you really shoulder the burden? My heart's in the palm of your hand. Here I'm standing naked before you. All my deepest secrets wide open. My heart's in the palm of your hand. Are you quite brave enough to accept the myriad of challenges? Are you quite brave enough to accept that I'm not who I used to be? As you can see, though scared and still bruised, I battled on through. Once again, a whole new beginning. Once again, I'm wiping the slate clean. My heart in the palm of your hand. My heart in the palm of your hand.
I'm scared to ask questions, afraid of the answers.
This place is a failure from what I so far have seen. We were impassioned so strongly, with mankind to save. It pains me to learn that our hopes were in vain.
But none of that matters, not with you here beside me.
For so long I have been desperate for this day.
I was very fortunate that I was able to online, who I'm still yet to meet him, in fact, make the acquaintance of a orchestrator whose name is Brian Freeland, and he makes film scores and video game scores. And using the technology that he uses, we're able to create an orchestra limited only in size by my imagination. So for the same difference of orchestrating for a small band, which is normally what you would do in the theatre, you'd think, what's the size of the pit and what's my budget, and you make decisions accordingly. But without those constraints, we were able to really go wild with our imaginations. And so we have 666 tubas and a gong the size of the side of a house, and sub-contrabass bassoons and sub-contrabass clarinets. We have 2 octaves of tuned timpani. We have it's enormous. We have a hurdy-gurdy. We have duduks. We have It's an enormous ensemble.
This raises an interesting question about the future of the show in terms of how it might be produced. Do you see the show as having a pre-recorded score in which case the sky's the limit. You really can have 30 tubas if you want that. Do you see it as having a production that's kind of in the opera tradition, where you have a full orchestra, in the symphonic sense, where you might have 40 or 50 musicians or more? Or is it more of something you see as following the tradition of chess in Les Mis, where you have a Broadway-style pit with a reduced set of orchestral forces that evokes some of the sense of the orchestra without literally having those numbers?
Well, I think what's quite exciting about this piece is that decision is not set in stone. So this piece has in the past been performed with just a piano very effectively. We could do it with a small band, and it would be authentic, and it would be terrific. Or we could do it with a full orchestra, and it would be spectacular. Realistically, the resource that I have of having made this album of these backing tracks means that with only 12 singers, we can take this very grand operatic experience to venues that would never otherwise be able to accommodate it. So we could potentially go to JCCs, old people's homes, schools, and community venues and deliver this incredible orchestral experience without actually having to bring an orchestra. So I would say the sky's the limit, really. I mean, if you say, hey, Carnegie Hall wants you, and there's a budget of X, Y, and Z, great, we'll bring in the Royal Philharmonic. If it's a matter of a small tour of community centres, then that's feasible. So I would say that from a selfish perspective, I just needed to hear these sounds out of my head and in the world, and the album has achieved that.
Listening to the concept album as it exists, I notice you've included not only the music, but also a substantial amount of dialogue from the show, often with underscore. So we have a sense of what the show might be like, and we're able to follow the story as well. How much of the show's dialogue do you feel is represented on the album?
At the moment, the majority of the dialogue is on the album. I would say that that's subject to change as the piece is further developed for the stage. If we were to involve another creative member or a dramaturg, they would certainly have an opinion about what could yet be added or changed to it to further develop it. So I would hope that as it's developed further, it may yet change form. There may be yet more nuances and more layers of intrigue and characterization. I'd love to develop it further, but at the moment, the current version is what has been recorded, and that was very important because it would have been substantially easier just to do an album of selections. But the way that this show has been written and rewritten and cut up and sewn back together throughout its development, the music and the text are so integrated with each other that to just take random selections from it, some of the most beautiful selections are now only 1 minute long and wouldn't necessarily work as a piece of music outside of the wider context in which they exist.
I actually salute that approach to musical storytelling. I think there is such a conscientious effort in many contemporary musicals to write songs that are free-floating and could just be dropped in the middle of a cabaret with no adjustments, that often the storytelling suffers as a result. And I admire here that you've really committed to the story and written songs that feel like they are part and parcel of the narrative.
Thank you. One of the things that I admire most in some of my favorite works are, I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, that they create their own musical paradigm, and that the music created or that exists within them could only ever really belong to those shows. And in fact, all of those ones that I mentioned when we were speaking earlier about the shows that have inspired me most of them have they create a very specific musical paradigm, and I really admire that, and that's what I sought to do in this. That I couldn't very easily just take a random bit of this music and drop it into another show, because it's created its own musical language, I guess.
Referring to one of the role models and one of both of your and my favorite shows, Chess, we can see that there are songs that do transport well out of the original context. Like we can think of Where I Want to Be, which works great in Chess, but we can relate to it outside of it. But also the biggest hit from Chess was One Night in Bangkok, and that song barely makes sense in the show. But we're forgiving of that. We can listen to a show that comes from the middle of a story, and maybe we don't understand exactly what's happening, but the spirit, if the song is written correctly and if the song is written evocatively, it draws us into that story and makes us curious about it. And I think that there's a healthy balance to be struck between both kinds of songs.
Absolutely. And it's important to strike balance when creating a work like this, because you're asking quite a lot of an audience member, that they should pay that much that much of their attention span should be devoted to this. But also the score of Chess was written with a different sensibility. It was written to have a rock pop element and work almost as a pop album, sort of, in a way that this never was. So there are I would say that Chess has lots of standalone pieces that could each be released as a single and function as structurally as a pop song in their own right, whereas this has far fewer of those, but strives still to be very tuneful and melodic. That was a really important consideration when we wrote this, which is, I think, one of the reasons that made it so difficult and such a long time to write, was that we really cared deeply about tune and melody, and that was something really important to strive to. And I wonder, in the future, should I write another piece, I might emancipate myself from that expectation and see whether that makes things easier or harder. Because this show is very, very tuneful and very melodic. And to do that for 2.5 hours was tricky.
Now, you recorded this concept album recently, meaning during the pandemic, where performers can't get together in a recording studio. How did you handle that mechanically and artistically?
That was a very comprehensive challenge. We had all sorts of dramas relating to COVID that we had to overcome. So when I arrived in the UK, I had to quarantine for 2 weeks. And on the last day of my quarantine, which was a Sunday, which was the day before rehearsals began, the government announced a national lockdown. So that meant all non-essential businesses had to close. So only open were takeaway restaurants, supermarkets, and pharmacies. And everything else was forced to close. And this included our recording studio. So we had to think on our feet. And because schools were allowed to remain open, we were able to hire the whole floor of the school, soundproof it, create booths, bring in equipment, create a control room, a green room with 24 hours to spare. We nearly lost our sound engineer, managed to convince him back by further enhancing our safety measures. Everybody had to be socially distanced from each other in the rehearsal room. Everybody had to wear masks and visors the entire time. We had to have, this is in the middle of winter, we had to have all the windows open for ventilation. And of course, right next door to us was a kindergarten. So every 15 minutes, the children would pour into the playground. And no exaggeration, literally banging pots and pans.
There's an interesting parallel to, you're recording a show about settlers in Siberia dealing with the harsh winds of winter. And it's kind of funny that you have your own windows open and are experiencing literal winds of winter.
Absolutely. Everyone was wrapped up like babushkas and we had to record. We had to record people separate from each other, and interpolate those recordings in post. So not all, because we only had 3 booths, and each booth between uses had to be aired out for 15 minutes for safety and sanitized and so on. So a lot of scenes have more than 3 people speaking at once, and so it was quite a challenge to record those and produce them, and as you can imagine. But the I would say the biggest challenge perhaps was performing in masks. I mean, rehearsing in masks, as if no one can hear anyone else's delivery or lines. And of course, I couldn't hear. So one of the things that distinguishes this show is some rather difficult to sing vocal arrangements that were quite experimental, and hearing those rehearsed with masks on, especially if you're requiring a singer to sing, beyond 2 octaves, parts of that voice is going to be very big and blustery, and parts of that voice is going to be very shrunken and small, just because of the anatomy of the voice. And that was all kind of taken into account when I was creating these vocal arrangements. But there was no way to tell with masks on if what I thought it would sound like was actually how it would sound. And so it was extraordinarily gratifying in the control room after the final voices. I mean, it's 12-part harmony for a lot of the ensemble material. When the last voice was mixed and mastered, and you could finally hear these experimental arrangements come to life. That was just wonderful, because it was touch and go. I had no idea how it would sound, and I'm very happy. I'm very happy with the ensemble material. I think it's really some of the highlights of the show. But recording them during a pandemic was very, very difficult. All sorts of jobs. We had an assistant who had to pull out because was forced into quarantine. We had just a pandemic is not an optimal time to be producing theatre.
What I'll say is that having listened to the cast album mostly with headphones, which is a very discriminating way of listening, I wouldn't have guessed that this was a pandemic recording. To me, it sounds like a studio recording, and in some cases like a well-produced live recording in a large space. So I would not have guessed that you were splicing together different vocals recorded in isolation.
Absolutely. I mean, that's all a top secret exclusive for your listeners. I would not normally go about telling people we recorded this in some broom cupboard in a school in East London, because it certainly doesn't sound like we did. It's our first of all, our cast were amazing, and I must say, to their credit, we rehearsed it with 4 days and 1 hour.
That is astounding, given the duration of the show. Yeah, that is very impressive.
4 days, 1 hour, masks on. It was I must say, to the cast's credit, they worked incredibly hard, and our sound engineer, to retain his sanity and working 14-hour days with a 2-hour commute, dealing with me for 2 weeks with no day off. Oh my goodness. His ingenuity saved the day. We were able to literally transform that school into a working professional studio, and you would never tell, listening to that recording, that anything was awry. So my hat goes off to everyone who was involved, that we were able to do this at such a difficult time in everyone's lives.
Now, you have been working on the show for a number of years, and the concept album is a fairly recent release, if my understanding is correct. Where do you see this show going from here? What are your hopes for the future, and what would you like to do with it, especially as the world emerges from the theater lockdown of 2020 and early 2021?
Well, I think it's been such a strange year for the art. I mean, for in so many ways, but especially for the arts, that there's so much uncertainty. I don't think it's necessarily a good idea for me to start having vision and expectations of what I want to happen next, in case the situation yet changes and makes those unfeasible. So I think in terms of what I would like to happen next, my focus currently has to be on sharing this recording with the industry and with the community, and letting people know that this show exists. I want to create a demand for a live performance. And the piece has never been performed in America, in the States, and I would love to introduce it to American audiences, whether that's a concert production like we did in the UK in 2014, or a staged production. I couldn't tell you. But one thing that so over the last years or so, we have been developing a translation of the show into Yiddish. And I would love to share this on stage. And I imagine the one cast performing on subsequent nights, the same show, one night in Yiddish, one night in English. And I would love to tour that, for example, around South Florida and New York, and get the show on its feet, introduce it to people. I think that would be a very, very exciting thing to do.
For Musical Talk listeners who would like to hear the concept album and experience the show in that form, where can they go? And where can they go just to follow the show more generally on social media and elsewhere?
So the best place to go for information about the show is sovietzion.com. There are some example tracks from the album, and a lot of information about the show, photographs, videos, all sorts of multimedia. And then if you would like to purchase the album, there are 2 releases available. The feature-length original concept album, which presents the full show from beginning to end as a musical radio play. And there's a second release of bonus material from the show sung in Yiddish by the same cast. And that's also available. They are both on iTunes, Apple Music, and Amazon. And there are direct links to all of those on our website, sovietzion.com.
How about the show itself? Are there social media accounts that our listeners can check out if they'd like to hear what's happening in the show's future?
Yes, absolutely. We have an Instagram account, we have a Twitter account, we have a Facebook group where I post regularly the press coverage we receive and new multimedia as it's released. And you can find links to all of those on sovietzion.com.
Excellent. Well, Giles, thank you so much for discussing this project and taking the time to talk. It has a lot of great musical content and a really interesting story that's drawing attention to a historically interesting period that is not well known. So I wish you every success with this adventure.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been my pleasure to speak to you, and I hope that your listeners will enjoy my work.
For more information about Musical Talk, please visit our website at musicaltalk.co.uk. You can email us at feedback@musicaltalk.co.uk, listen to past episodes on iTunes and YouTube, and follow our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.